And we're back. Buenos Aires. Argentine Prison Museum, episode 4. I just had a coffee. And I guess since we're in Buenos Aires, I should share with you that I had a cappuccino. And you're probably saying to yourself, well, in Buenos Aires, there is more than one type of cappuccino. Melissa and I learned that one day in a cafe. The waiter said, "Cappuccino? Okay, yeah." And he asked Melissa if she wanted cappuccino Italiano. And neither of us had actually heard of cappuccino Italiano. And she affirmatively nodded, yeah. And he brought to the table an enormous cup of cappuccino topped with whipped cream, cookies, you name it. It was a meal in and of itself. So I mentioned that when you're in Buenos Aires and you want to go beyond the standard cappuccino, Italiano. Okay, enough of that. Last time we left off with Ushuaia, Tierra del Fuego. This is the tip of the dagger. And this is the Argentine Siberia that was developed by the modern state. But let's move on. So as we walk down the corridor, we see a series of galleries that are contained in these rooms, and each room has a thematic narrative. Let's step in this one and identify this thematic narrative. Penitenciaria Nacional. This is the National Penitentiary. In previous episodes, we have examined this phenomenon on how the state embraces the prison as an extension of state power, as a modernizing force. It is not something to be ashamed of. It is something to be proud of. These prison museums, recall Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, where prison reformers from all over the globe would travel to Philadelphia to tour, to inspect, to try to understand the inner workings of the Quaker philosophy with respect to prison science. And this was also unfolding in Buenos Aires. And let's take a look at what they did, because this is really fascinating. By now you've realized that I've got a thing about architecture. I like cities. And one of the reasons I like cities is because they feature architecture. And what we have before us, and if you've watched the previous episodes on Eastern State, Philadelphia, this is a seamless transition into the influence of the radial plan, which was designed by John de Havilland, Eastern State. And you might recall in Eastern State, this spoken hub design, this radial plan, was offset by way of demands by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to start adding more tiers to what we would call the left-hand side of the otherwise symmetrical plan. This is a much better replication of de Havilland's design. I think de Havilland would be really pleased with how symmetrical this particular expression of the radial design is. I mean, we see the hub, we see which is the control center, we see the tiers fanning out into other buildings, and it is panoptic in the sense that the officers stationed in the center can peer down each of these cell blocks. But what's even more interesting, if you pay attention, recall the prison museum tour in Melbourne, Australia. We spent time talking about the exercise yard, which was a panoptic expression of penal control. And here we see, I'm circling this with the cursor, this is like a half of the exercise yard that we witnessed in Melbourne. Here, the prisoner would be brought in and funneled into each of these little compartments. And then the guard would stand on the top, right here where I'm pointing, and he could peer into each of these compartments, providing surveillance and visual control over the prisoner and so on and so forth. I should mention that back to Eastern State has influenced penal design in the 1830s, 40s, and beyond, to the extent that more than 300 prisons around the world can trace their paternity to Eastern State, Philadelphia. And here is a prime example of this design. Let's keep moving. Once again, walking down the corridor, and we see more thematic narratives. And we're being welcomed into this room by a mannequin in a uniform. He is extending an invitation to visitors. This is not like the director's room that has a barrier in form of a velvet rope that partitions the room from visitors. This is wide open, and this mannequin is drawing us in. I mention that because this is museum studies. This is sociology. This is phenomenology, which examines and considers mental states. The mental process of leaving one room and entering another has an emotive register. And that's how phenomenologists and sociologists talk about these experiences. So briefly, when you're in your apartment or your house, your home, and you leave your living room and enter the kitchen, there's a different emotional register there. And then you leave the kitchen, you come back to the living room, and there's another reset of the mental state. I mention that because these rooms have within them different mental states because of the narration. Let's go in. And what this speaks to visitors is right out of Emile Durkheim and more directly Mary Douglas, where both of these sociologists and anthropologists recognize themes of danger. And danger is one of the binaries that rivals purity. Purity is on one end of the cultural scale, and danger is off to the outer limits that oftentimes poses a threat to purity and order that we've talked a little bit about before. This room speaks to how the prison is a place of danger. And prisoners have to be controlled with the threat or use of force. So we see all these weapons, and I think it's clearly over the top, especially from a North American aspect. You have a rifle with a bayonet. You've got a machine gun over here, so on and so forth. You have these pistols. And I'm thinking, North America and Europe, where I've been in prisons, the officers are not armed, at least those on the interior. There are armed officers in the guard towers on the perimeter. But nevertheless, this draws visitors into this world of danger and reminds us this is hazardous duty. Down the hallway, we see another room that invites us in. And rather than a mannequin inviting us into this room, we are invited into the room by the Argentine flag and the crucifix. Church and state. Another reminder of this integration, the sharing of power between the state and the church. And as I've said before, the Argentine culture, the way I interpret the Argentine culture, is that the state draws heavily from the church to bolster its own legitimacy. And in upcoming episodes, I'm going to talk about prisons in the period of the last dictatorship, where we're going to see that power sharing emerge in even more forceful expressions of control. But let's go in. And our mental state changes once again. Here we are. I was really taken back by this because as a sociologist and a criminologist, this speaks to early criminology. And we need to really unpack this carefully because criminology in Argentina drew heavily in its early pioneering days from the Italian model. Now, criminologists are invited to enter the food fight over which country can claim to be the initial pioneers in modern criminology. The Americans will try to get into the debate. They'll be quickly pushed out by the French, the English, and the Italians. The Italian school is a paradigm for Argentine criminologists. And much like the Italian school, there's an enormous overlap between institutions of law and institutions of medicine. And this apothecary cabinet speaks to medicine. We need to pause and get another cup of coffee.